Awesome. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Paratosh and this is Matt, and we're the student co-leads of the Leadership Now project chapter here at MIT.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. For those of you part of the network of business and civic leaders who see a healthy democracy as the basic infrastructure for a strong economy and a stable, innovative society. At the national level, Leadership Now invests in leaders, engages on policy, and partners across sectors to protect and renew American democracy.
And in the spirit of answering big questions about our democracy, we're honored to welcome two distinguished speakers today who have thought deeply about the intersection of democracy, economics, and power. Many of you know Simon Johnson as the 2024 Nobel Prize winner in economics, but Simon is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan, head of the Global Economics and Management Group, and co-director of MIT Sloan's Stone Center, the MIT Stone Center Initiative on Inequality and the Future of Work. He's written widely on crises, institutions, and technology, most recently as co-author of Power and Progress.
We're also absolutely thrilled to welcome Susan Stokes. She is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy. Her new book, which we're going to discuss today, The Backslider, Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies, examines why democratic leaders sometimes chip brought them to power and how actors like voters can slow that erosion.
We're very grateful to both Simon and Sue for joining us, and to all of you for carving out the time to be here for this really important conversation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Simon and Sue.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Sue. Great introduction, guys, by the way. You can be front men for any of my shows. And so my job is very simple. I've got a few fun softball questions just to warm up the Sue and the audience and get you to ask and engage as much as possible. Then I'm going to sit down and eat my lunch. So that's my objective, is to get out of the way and have as much direct discussion as possible. But first of all, Sue, the title and the theme. What do you mean by backsliders, and what is this process of democratic erosion as you see it?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks everybody for your interest. It's great to see you all here today. I have to start with
is that on or hold it?
Is it on? You can hear me?
Hold it closer,
I have to hold it closer. So I just have to say I met Simon for the first time probably a month ago, and I congratulated him, and he said, "Oh, what for?" And I said, "Well, for the Nobel Prize." And he said, "Oh, that was ages ago." So he wears it lightly, but it's great to be here. It's great to. I'm really grateful for the invitation. So backsliding is it's become a term of art of late in political science. It's synonymous with democratic erosion. I've heard the term lately, which maybe is more apt in the United States today, which is democratic breakdown. It is a phenomenon whereby presidents and prime ministers are elected, sort of duly elected in free and fair elections, and then turn around and pretty immediately start, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly and less subtly, to undermine their own democratic institutions. So they go after the press, they go after the courts, legislatures, oversight bodies, independent organizations, NGOs, the civil service. They fire the members of the bureaucracy and replace them with loyalists. And there's a kind of common and depressingly sort of parallel across countries pattern to this.
Okay, so so Sue's book, which we bought some copies. They're going to be available on Kindle. We'll show you how you can get one of a free copy, free with purchase of tuition at MIT. We'll show you at the end how you can get one of those. So what's great about the book, Sue, is you put it in comparative perspective, and you sort of show you're not only focused on the US. You've got lots of other countries there, and you're arguing that this is a much broader phenomenon that's actually been going on for at least a couple of decades. So what's the playbook? When you say the backsliders have a sort of an approach to this, or things they do, how do you see that playbook in its current form?
Yeah, I'm going to move ahead. So this is a kind of a sketch of the playbook, and we call it a playbook because, as I mentioned, it sort of appears over and over again in somewhat different levels of severity and maybe with different timing, but over and over again across the 24 countries that have experienced democratic backsliding at the very end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. So, as I mentioned, the press is a target, the courts are a target, elections, both sort of confidence in the integrity of elections and also election administration bodies, legislatures, so legislatures in their oversight functions, members of the opposition party who are leaders in the legislature are also attacked. The civil administration becomes politicized and harassed, and just large numbers of people fired. Other public bodies, I think that you're probably aware of threats to the independence of the Federal Reserve here in the U.S., that there are equivalent kind of attacks on independent or semi-independent public bodies elsewhere, and then civil society organizations. So just to give one example, the Modi government in India has made illegal 20,000 NGOs on the grounds that they receive support from foreign sources, foreign funding sources. So the general effort is to undermine what we call accountability, both vertical and horizontal accountability. Some of you may have read some things about democratic theory. The idea, one of the things that makes democracies different from despotisms, autocracies, is that governments are accountable. They're accountable to the people. That is, that the people can decide, we don't like this government anymore, we're going to vote it out. And they're accountable, and the people need to be well informed. There has to be a free and fair press. And they're also accountable horizontally to other branches of government and to other sort of public and independent bodies, whistleblowers and the like. So the effort that is made, the reason that the playbook takes the form it does, the reason that you get the targets you do, is that the essence of backsliding is executive aggrandizement, so the aggrandizement of the power of the executive and of the president or prime minister, and to achieve that, they need to attack all these different institutions.
All right, so we can come back to all these specifics. We're just sort of, in this opening, giving you guys a bit of an overview, stir the pot in terms of questions. So I want to jump to the issue about income inequality, which is something we care a lot about in the Stone Center, something we do a lot of research on, the sort of economics of that. But your point, if I understand correctly, is that inequality in many of these places has fed into or motivated or become even maybe a tool or a weapon in the hands of people who backslide away from democracy.
So income inequality turns out to be the structural cause or factor that increases a democracy's chances of experiencing democratic erosion. That, I am proud to say, is kind of a discovery that a colleague of mine and I made. Eli Rao of Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. We have a paper that came out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year. And we just did an old-fashioned kind of cross-national comparative statistical study where we took all democracies, threw them into a data set, looked at the levels of income inequality, Gini coefficients, and you'll know that the higher Gini coefficient, the higher the level of inequality, wealth distributions, how long they had been uninterrupted democracies, the level of state capacity, income per capita, so GNP per capita, and so forth. And the factor that came out as robust and strongly related to the chances of democratic erosion was income inequality. And it was, it was a remarkably robust and strong relationship. We tried to get rid of it, as you should do in these kinds of statistical studies, and eventually came to the conclusion that the only way to get rid of it was to unplug our laptops. And that's surprising. It is surprising as well. I mean, it isn't surprising that income inequality is sort of in the background on all this, but the strength of the relationship and the fact that it was more important than other economic factors, such as income per capita, was actually something that we found slightly surprising. So there's an older literature that looks at the causes of breakdown of democracy in a world in which those breakdowns mostly were via military coups, and that literature has emphasized income per capita, to some extent inequality, but Simon's co-Nobel Prize winners, Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, tried very hard to, and you guys as well, tried very hard to find statistical evidence of inequality as a cause of democratic breakdowns in the world of military coups, and didn't really find that to be true. So this is kind of a, we're looking at we're looking at democratic erosion as a distinct dependent variable, different from coups, different actors, different objectives, different dynamics, and when we do that, income inequality is the story. Now, there are all kinds of connective tissue that need to be put in to explain the connection between income inequality and democratic erosion, and if you read my book, you'll get a sense of that connective tissue.
Yeah. So, and just one more point on the connective tissue, because I think in addition to the finding about inequality, you've got a very plausible theory or story about how polarization, various forms of polarization, so rich versus poor, or across different kinds of groups, how that actually feeds into and becomes part of the playbook of the backsliders.
Yeah. So the more unequal the distribution of income, in general, the more polarized a polity, and that's something that various scholars have found. That's true across states in the U.S. It's true internationally as well. So one of the effects of income inequality is to encourage partisan polarization, and it does that in a direct way. So people just become more polarized when they live in highly unequal places. But it's also something that backsliding leaders take advantage of. They benefit from operating in a highly polarized setting, basically because when people think that the other side is really terrible, that the sky is going to fall should the hated, social democrats or Republicans or Christian Democrats or whoever it is, Congress Party, whoever it is, come to power, then they're more willing to tolerate undemocratic actions on their own side. They are more willing to wink at attacks on the courts, attacks on the press, not necessarily because they don't really like democracy anymore. In fact, that is not what has been found. It isn't that we're not experiencing a wave of erosion of democracy because people don't like democracy anymore. That is not the case. Even though they like democracy as an idea of a system of government, even though they might favor the institutions of democracy in their particulars, they are willing to say, okay, I'm willing to give up on this aspect of democracy or this amount of democracy because it would be a disaster if the other side came to power. Now, there are some limits to that, which I talk about in the book as well, but it's important to notice that those are effects of income inequality. A more partisan polarized setting, which then the leaders take advantage of and further polarize things by using very polarized discourse. This will be familiar to you. Donald Trump typically says that the Democrats are a lawless mob, that they don't care about the country, they want to throw open the borders, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a discourse that there are parallels in many backsliding countries around the world.
So last question from me. The book, I think, really provokes the reader to think hard about, what does it mean to play by the rules? If the backsliders are bending the rules, breaking the rules, not abiding by the norms, should people who are resisting the backslide want or propose or put forward their own changes, play a little bit hardball? That's the question you have.
Yes.
I have my specific question. Okay. So I heard Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson speak last night. I pay a lot of attention to what Ketanji Jackson says because when she was a federal judge, she and I carpooled together. Actually, our daughters went to the same chorus for a year, and a true story. And I had this fantastic collection of emails I plan to donate to the Smithsonian along the lines of, can you do next Tuesday? I'm going to be out of town. Sure, no problem, and so on. So. And Ketanji Jackson, who's an amazing force of nature, was talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896 decision that said in a Supreme Court decision with only one dissent, it was okay for African Americans to have separate facilities, for example, for education, as long as they were equal. This is the separate but equal doctrine that loomed very large over American life for 50 years explicitly, and probably still, you could argue today, I would argue still today. Now, there used to be a more or less balance in the Supreme Court. It used to go back and forth, and it used to feel that it could sway either way. But as a result of hardball tactics, I would suggest, it's now got a 6-3 majority wired in and hard to overcome. Now, if the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of the rules, and you want them to be fair and be able to vote either way, for example, on the tariff case. Oh, I did learn the only thing Justice Jackson said yesterday that I didn't know was they've already decided on the tariff case. They decide within 2 days, but it takes a while for them to write it up and notify the rest of us. So that huge decision about the future of the U.S. Constitution and the rules and power of Congress that decision has been made, and we just don't know what it is yet. So my proposal, my modest proposal, Sue, for you, your consideration and the audience, but I want everyone else to be thinking about their own proposals, is 5 more justices for the Supreme Court. So if it's 6-3 as a result of hardball tactics, why not put up 5 people, make it 8-6, and the next time the other team comes in, they'll put in their own 3 or 5 or 6. Sooner or later, we'll be at 27 Supreme Court justices, which may not be ideal, but it's addressing, I think, exactly what you're raising here, which is how do you make sure that the rules and the arbiters of the rules stay sufficiently neutral?
Yeah, that's an interesting proposal. So, court packing. This is the specific, and then we can talk about the general problem of
court has already been packed, Sue. It's been packed by the other team.
Yes, it has been packed. In fact, I decided that that's the appropriate word to use when I heard one of my very modest, very even-headed American politics colleagues just say, well, the court is packed. So, well, how is the court packed? I mean, so look at what happened to the rule. The rule, what's a rule? A rule is the practices that that the key actors use to take actions. The rule in appointing new justices to the Supreme Court used to be the president nominates someone, the Senate and evaluates the nominee and either confirms or doesn't confirm. Since the actions by Mitch McConnell in the first Trump administration, we have new rules, effective rules.
Gary was also, remember this better than I do. I think it was the end of the Obama administration. So the norm was that the president could put up somebody as long as it's not right at the end of the administration.
Sorry, I misspoke. That's right.
Mitch McConnell said, nope, there's a year to go. But
right. So the rule has become, in effect, to get a new justice to the Supreme Court, you have to have a Republican president and a Republican-controlled Senate. If you have a Democratic president and the Republicans in charge of the Senate, it won't happen. So that's not a viable rule because, especially if that's the rule the Republicans use and there's not a kind of quid pro quo, tit for tat type response on the part of the Democrats, it basically means that you're just going to have a forever drift toward a fully conservative Supreme Court, and that's not viable. So we kind of need a new rule, and people have been talking about how to do that. And I think one proposal has been what we would think of as court packing in the old FDR sense, what Simon is proposing, add new justices. Another is to kind of play around at the edges with the rules in ways that would change the composition of the court over a longer time period. So fixed terms, maybe fixed retirement ages, and the FDR, the kind of court packing proposal, raises a lot of hackles. It's sort of the problem that what it would do is persuade a big chunk of the population and the leadership that, in fact, it's true that there's no such thing as neutral rules or neutral institutions. It's all partisanship. It's a big fix in forever. You could explain to people that the fix goes back to McConnell and so forth. Yeah. But that would be a cost of that kind of action. The cost of not taking that kind of action would be potentially a Supreme Court that just does not function in the way that it's supposed to function. And I think that would be really bad for the court. I mean, eventually the court's legitimacy, which has already sunk a lot, would just sink to nothing, and it would be very difficult to kind of...
My last remark, and I sit down, so we're turning to the audience now, raise your hands, and when you do speak, please identify yourself and also tell Sue anything about your background that you think is interesting, relevant.
So just one final comment on that. So this is a problem not just for the court, it's a problem in general. How are we going to fix the institutions in this society? How do people fix institutions that have been attacked in periods of backsliding? And there is always, I would suggest, a trade-off that has to be evaluated case by case between the further delegitimation or loss of confidence in institutions and a loss of democracy itself. And those things, there's not going to be a ready answer. There's not a single answer to that question. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks for being here, MBA student.
With a name?
Adam. Yeah. Proud to be named. So I understand, and I totally agree with the causal link between inequality being a strong predictor and cause of backsliding. And so there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. I'm curious about when a non-trivial part of the polity or electorate not just wants to punish the opposition, but actually embraces non-democracy as a value and as a means to pursue, which I view as slightly different, and how one moves forward when that's no longer, when a belief in autocracy as an end in itself or as a viable political system is no longer a fringe belief.
Yes, and that is a real danger. It's something we're observing in this country and has happened in other countries as well. I think as long as that is a phenomenon of sort of civil society, public opinion, then the tools of persuasion and showing people that democratic institutions and states can work well, can achieve things that they want them to achieve, clarifying the loss of freedom that comes from a loss of democracy. So, the second Trump administration has actually been helpful in that regard. I think people are much more aware that it's not a good thing when people can be picked up off the street by masked people and stuck in cars, or extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean Ocean and so forth. When this is when it's at the level of public opinion, when political parties, important political parties, begin to espouse openly anti-democratic positions, that is another level of kind of alarms that go off. And there are different answers for different countries. So think about Germany with the history it has. It is constitutional for political parties to be excluded if they deny the Holocaust, if they advocate for authoritarian regimes. That's known as militant democracy. It's sort of like you need to have tools to protect a democracy from competing parties that want to destroy democracy. And that's something that we sort of saw some kind of echo of that with the court cases about that appealed to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and tried to exclude Donald Trump from the ballot in 2024 on the grounds that he had caused an insurrection, and that didn't go forward. That was Ketanji Brown Jackson was part of that decision as well. The problem with implementing those mechanisms or activating those mechanisms is if the political party in question is really popular, there's some kind of big smell test that it doesn't pass. And that's where they're coming out in Germany. The German, the sort of non-far right parties, the sort of legacy traditional parties in Germany have said, we're not trying to exclude the AfD. What we're trying to do is persuade people not to vote for it. It legally, institutionally, constitutionally, they could exclude. That there were decisions saying that it could be excluded. It's just politically very difficult to do. So you have to, again, it's sort of the same problem. How do you weigh what the effect is going to be in public opinion, what the further denigration of people's understanding or further decay of the confidence in institutions versus are we saving democracy? And so it's a tough balance that has to be explored in every case. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for being.
I guess you're supposed to say your name.
Gabrielle.
Oh, I got it. There you are.
Second year MBA, and my question relates to other democracies.
To
other democracies.
Yes.
So, for example, Netflix has a documentary called The Edge of Democracy, which tells the story of Brazil in 2002, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, and then
Yes.
how Bolsonaro came to power.
Yep.
But we have seen this movement across many other democracies, right? And democracy in Brazil is, let's say, pretty recent. The new republic after dictatorship in 89, 90s. So our democracy is 30, 35 years, so pretty recent. But on the other hand, the U.S. democracy is 200, 300 years. But we have seen the same movement like across the globe. And how do you perceive that? How do you see this like kind of backsliders movement popping up in different parts of the country?
Well, it's a very apt question. Thank you, Gabriel. When we used to study democratic instability in the era when that was often military coups of the kind that Brazil experienced several of, it was certainly the case that the age of democracy was an important factor. Think about cancer. Think about, somebody has cancer, they get treated, they go into remission, they're in remission for, let's say, 5 years, and by the 5 years out, they're no more likely to have that kind of cancer again than someone who's never had it. So same was true of coups. If you had a coup, and I think the magic number was 6 years, after 6 years of uninterrupted democratic rule, you had no greater likelihood of experiencing a coup than a country that hadn't experienced one. What did matter was income, the wealth of the country, and as well as the age of democracy. So it's kind of remarkable that is not true. That's another thing that's sort of a non-result that Eli and I, kind of knocked our socks off. It doesn't matter how old a democracy is. And it isn't just that the oldest democracy on the planet, the United States, has experienced backsliding. Take that case out of the sample, you get the same result. So the uninterrupted, survival of democracy is not a guarantee for avoiding democratic backsliding. Brazil is a great example, extremely income unequal country. Some improvements in income distribution, as was true in many Latin American countries during the commodities boom of the early 2000s, and also as a result of public policy, things like the conditional cash transfer programs that they fight over, was it Brazil or Mexico that came up with them in the first place. So there were some improvements, but still very unequal distribution of income. And democracy kind of struggled along. And, I don't have to tell you, I think you're Brazilian, I don't have to tell you, there were some real ups and downs, but free and fair elections, pretty much a free press, maybe a bit of a free-for-all with the press, legislative opposition, all of the hallmarks of a democracy that, with all its troubles, was kind of, functioning at some level. And then you get the election of Jair Bolsonaro, who comes in 2018 and really does his best to kind of make a mess of democracy, including a kind of U.S. 2020-like, episode of claiming fraud in the 2022 elections and trying to hold on to power nevertheless. So, So what I will say is that there are some differences in these kinds of cases. So, in general, actually, Bolsonaro is a little bit of an exception here, but in general, in the global South, the kind of backslider that, ideologically speaking, is a left populist. So think López Obrador in Mexico, think Evo Morales in Bolivia, think Rafael Correa in Ecuador, et cetera, et cetera. And in the more advanced democracies, they tend to be right-wing ethno-nationalists. The playbook is the same, but the ideological orientation is different, and that means some of the public policy is different. So López Obrador in Mexico increased the minimum wage, made retirement more generous, did some things about income inequality at the same time that he destroyed the courts as independent actors, has winked at really violent actions against the press, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
And I think we don't have an answer, right? We are debating.
Yeah. I mean, what the happy part of the Brazil story is that Bolsonaro was held to account by the courts. Of course, here again we see this problem of you held to account. That's a good thing. The man was out to destroy democracy, so it's good that he won't be able to run for office again. On the other hand, there's a big swath of Brazilian society that says, you see, it's all political. The courts are, this is a weaponization of the judiciary, which, by the way, it's not. So the judge, the judge who went after Bolsonaro is no friend of Lula's. He's, he was really, it really wasn't that. But that's the cost. It's an inevitable cost, even when it was the right thing to do. I wouldn't even call it hardball going after Bolsonaro legally. It's really following the rule of law. Thank you. Question right there.
Hi, Rizal, first year MBA. I'm curious if you see like a point of no return in this backslider playbook. I know like Basha Gessen for the New York Times was written about her experience in Soviet Russia, where Putin was able to consolidate so much power to the point where even if another party was able to win an election, it happened like the constitution had already been changed and amended to, keep Putin in power, that just wouldn't matter. Just curious what your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, was it Ronald Reagan who used to say never say never? Who knows what could happen in Russia eventually. By the way, Russia looks like a kind of an instance of democratic backsliding, but it never actually became technically democratic enough to backslide. There are several cases, unfortunately, of leaders who came to power via democratic means, eroded their democracies, and now they are autocracies. That's true of Venezuela. It's true of Nicaragua. It, depending on how you look at things, could be true in Turkey. So that's a story. There also are instances of backsliding leaders losing at re-election, submitting themselves to term limits or accepting term limits. Sometimes they do that after they haven't accepted term limits one time around, get reelected, but then eventually they say, okay, term limits keep me from running again. There are instances of backsliding leaders being yanked from office by their own political parties. So that happened to Jacob Zuma in South Africa. The ANC pulled him out of office, Simon may get mad about this. I code the UK under the Johnson administration, not as a case of backsliding, but kind of a near miss. And Johnson, of course, was forced to resign by the leadership of his political party, the Conservative Party. Often that happens when the popularity of the president or prime minister has dropped to the point, including among their own electorate, so that the party views them as a liability in future elections. We certainly have examples of sort of what you're saying. Things become so baked in. So there's no opposition political parties in Nicaragua. There's, every municipality in the country, every position in the parliament, the president, et cetera, is controlled by the Sandinistas. It would take a big kind of set of events to reverse that. Not impossible, but it could. But that's what it would take. Venezuela, Maduro lost the election very decisively, very badly, the last presidential election, and they just said, "Screw you, we're not going to pay attention to that. We're going to pretend that he won." I think what we need to look at is. I'm not willing to say that any of these cases is beyond possibility. There are predictable vulnerabilities in autocratic rule. So autocracy is often not a very good decision-making mechanism. Autocrats tend to surround themselves with people who are more loyal than they are competent. So they make mistakes, and oppositions are able to take advantage of those mistakes. And there are a number of other strategies that have been effective against these kinds of leaders. So I don't think ever we can say it's too late. I mean, anything could happen in Venezuela. It's a very unstable situation, I think, in Venezuela today.
Can we go to the left of the room?
Yes, sorry.
We've balanced one at MIT.
Yep.
Alfred is Anna.
Alfred.
Hi, thank you. Alfred, first year MBA. I'm just wondering, going back to the point about inequality and democratic backsliding, I'm wondering if you take that to extreme, is that a way to think of it? It's almost like a historical materialist way of thinking about democracy as a manifestation of the underlying economic conditions. And I'm also just thinking back to the history of like a lot of the democracies, the older democracies you see today, manifest out of the almost settler sort of colonies or settler countries sort of hundreds of years ago, where you had the politically sort of active population were relatively economically equal, and then you take that to the idea that the form of political governance arising from that is democracy. Whereas today, because of, to an extent, trends in capitalism and inequality, sort of reversing that sort of underlying economic base, does that make democracy more difficult or even impossible as you have that trend sort of on the economic side moving forward? Is that a viable way of thinking about it?
So, is your question the assumption the observation you're starting with is that that high levels of income inequality were a kind of the structural setting out of which democracies emerged in an earlier period? Okay.
The reversal of that being what we're seeing now to an extent
Yeah.
in both advanced democracies and also emerging ones.
Well, I think you'd get some quarrels with the idea that democracy in, say, the 19th century or in some settings in the early 20th century emerged because of high levels of income inequality. But set that aside, I think that there is that correcting income and just redistribution. So using fiscal tools, social policy tools, etc., to reduce the very high levels of income inequality that we see in several countries, including the United States today, is an investment in democracy. I personally think that income inequality is morally wrong and that economically doesn't make sense, etc. But add to that list that you're investing in the resilience of democracy by having societies that are less income polarized. And I think that there are many subtler, Simon, you should answer this question, but I think there are subtle effects of income inequality that don't even, not the first things to come to mind. So the first thing to come to mind probably when I say to you income inequality is a cause of democratic backsliding is, well, it creates a kind of grievance culture, a kind of sense of being left behind, which is a great source of frustration, and that can be sort of channeled toward hatred toward another, as in right-wing ethno-nationalism, or it can be channeled into a very sort of extreme attacks on the wealthy and international capital, and that's more typical of left populism, and all of that is true. There also are effects on wealthy people. So, very old article that you guys should take a look at. Seymour Martin Lipset in 1959 published an article in the American Political Science Review in which he basically posited that poor countries are more likely to be autocracies and more equal countries are more likely to be democracies. And he said one of the reasons is, think about the effect, what's it like to be a very wealthy person living in a very income unequal place, and the proposition is to give more political rights to poor people. They don't want to do that, and they need to justify in their minds why they don't do that, and so they sort of they take on the view that the poor are subhuman, beyond the pale. So there are effects on rich people as well, and I think there also are weird effects on, like this whole thing about affordability. I'd love to have more of a conversation with you folks about this. So what's the problem of affordability? Well, it's really so think about the housing market. Think about housing being unaffordable. So if markets like housing tilt toward the higher end consumers because the margins are just so great at the higher end, then you're taking away supply presumably from the lower end, and you just housing becomes unaffordable. So affordability actually is, I think, a rallying cry that has to do with is a good political position to take. It connects people's felt frustrations with their daily lives, but it also has to do underneath that with income inequality.
Yeah, I think big question, and Gary may want to come on this too.
Yeah.
Big question on that is, I agree that inequality is become much more salient in recent decades in the US, and that people focus on that. But the affordability is actually about the level of income. So if Elon Musk gets $1 trillion and I'm fine, does that bother me as much as I can't afford daycare or health insurance, and the rich people are doing great, and that sort of aggravates the annoyance? But Gary had his hand up too.
Yeah.
So I apologize, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to give you a question.
Yeah. How about a microphone? Matt's hogging this microphone to the back.
Matt, I like this turnaround. Thanks. Thank you so much for a provocative talk, and I will get your book and read Backsliding. I'm interested in the reverse of that, front sliding, if there is such a term. If not, you can appropriate it. But the U.S., just focus on the U.S., has had 230 years of this experiment, and we've had some really bad times. The Jim Crow, McCarthy era, the Civil War. We've had a lot of bad stuff go down in this country. But I grew up and came of age after Nixon stepped down, and I realize now in hindsight I took things for granted. Did we front slide after Nixon? Did we kind of get to a more democratic system because somehow it got so bad? Or is the current president actually the worst backslider in our history? My posit is that we've had some pretty bad backsliding in 230 years previously, and that post-Nixon we front slided.
Yes. So agreed that I think so the coding, which we've gone to a lot of trouble. So when figuring out what are cases of democratic backsliding and what are cases of sort of garden variety executives, testing the flexing their muscles, which happens all the time, certainly happened under Barack Obama, Bush, even more so, et cetera. It's important to distinguish those two things. And I can bore you guys with the mechanics of how we've done that, but I think we are doing that effectively. But we have not gone back in time. So this is really a very presentist project. It really goes back to the end of the 20th century. And there are, I think Nixon has to, if we did go back, and we had the good data to do so, I think Nixon would be a case of democratic backsliding. And so, we have been in bad places before. And yes, I think we did see front sliding. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been surprised to hear rules or practices that I thought were much older, because I remember Nixon, actually were the result of the post-Watergate era. So, for example, the norm, which you'd love to be more than just a norm, that the Department of Justice is independent of the executive. That's after Nixon. So yes, I think there was front sliding. A lot of that front sliding is being disarticulated as we speak, but presumably we could learn collectively again to front slide again and also bake those things in a little bit more.
I've been asked at economic conferences, well, will this revert to the mean? Donald Trump won't be president forever, and hopefully not a third term, but, even though he's 79-year-old.
President Xi and Vladimir...
I don't think it will revert that quickly.
No. President Xi and Vladimir Putin discussing living to 150. Let's just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
I think it will take a lot longer to front slide.
Yes, and I want to say a word about that. I also want to go back quickly to what Simon was saying before. So one of the reasons why you don't just instantly revert is that there are changes that happen in people's the mass public perceptions of their political systems that then become a real problem for full redemocratization, if you want to use that term. So, for example, the fact that a majority of Republican voters continue to believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, and therefore that our system of elections in this country does not deserve our confidence. That is an obstacle, and the same kinds of things are obstacles in Poland today. Even though the PIS party was voted out initially, was voted out of parliament, control of parliament. We talked about how that continues to be a problem in Brazil. So that once the genie's out of the bottle in the public's views, their confidence in institutions, that's difficult to repair. It has to be repaired, but it's not an instantaneous thing. Just really quickly, so the affordability thing, that I think of that as an example of why you don't have to be aware of where you are even in the income distribution. It's just harder if you're a low income person. It's harder to live in a country with highly unequal distribution of income than in a country with less. So it's harder to be an American at the low end of the distribution of income because housing is going to be more expensive for you than to be a Swede where income distribution is more. It's a response in a way to exactly the objection that you're hearing, which is, what do I care that there's a super wealthy guy out there? If I'm doing okay, I'm doing okay. If I'm not, I'm not.
When I first came to the US to graduate school in 1985, I was really, really young. What struck me was the amount of I think the term is up-identification. Yes. There are a lot of people who were not well off felt they would become well off and felt that they didn't want high taxes on the richer up because that would be them pretty soon. And that, compared to the UK or Europe, was quite dramatic. And I think there is still quite a bit of that in the US compared to some other places. But it does seem like the affordability issue in particular highlights the fact that ordinary people feel that they can't make ends meet. Now, the ends may include having a cell phone, which in 1985 nobody had a cell phone, obviously. So, but what's regarded as being the acceptable target standard of living is slipping away from more people.
Yes,
and that's an absolute standard of living.
Yes. So it is. You're right. So beautiful study by Larry Bartels, political scientist, of the so-called death tax, where, so that goes back, that study goes back 15 years, I think, where, it basically, a lot of the American public sort of thinks, I guess you could think of us as boundless optimists. I will have so many millions of dollars when I die, and I want my kids to get it, even if I have, I'm living paycheck to paycheck now. Now that's reduced in the U.S. So there's more class conflict over this stuff now. So there's much more support, for example, for various sort of tax the rich proposals than there used to be in public opinion. But you're right, and that up identification is a curious thing. So Donald Trump says, I'm really, really, really wealthy. Even back when he wasn't really, really wealthy, I love the jibe against him. He's a thousandaire, But that was back in the day. Now he really is a billionaire. So I'm really, really, really wealthy. And then almost in the same breath, and I've always loved hanging out with bricklayers, and I'm a construction guy, and I hate Wall Street. So it's a complicated psychological thing, and I think it is different in the United States from other places. Sorry, we had a bunch of hands back there.
Use the microphone, I think, Matt. Get the microphone.
Back in the middle, and then there's others over.
Thank you. Vivek, I'm in the System Design and Management program. I hate having to ask this question, but all of these entries are 2022. Post-2022, we're in an AI first era. Yeah. Do you think AI will accelerate backsliding, or is it a way to combat it into the future?
Well, I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but I'll take a shot at it. I think that there's potential for AI to be used to exacerbate problems of false beliefs and conspiracy theorizing, which is a problem. There are. If you want people to believe that you are the object of massive fraud, and that was not the case, then you have to make a lot of things up. And that can be helped by mechanics coming out of AI. On the other hand, I have colleagues who are optimistic about the potential for democracy building via AI. So I'm just going to say I'm agnostic. There are reasons for concern, but there may also be reasons for optimism.
Can I suggest that on our current course, it's going to go very badly because AI is going to make impersonation seem commonplace, and you worry about that a lot in elections. And my proposal, which Sue and I were talking about before, is in a radical departure from the views of some people in the US. I think we should all carry unimpeachable ID with us, and we should use those to vote. You should have to show that ID, which cannot be or is extremely hard to hack. And that's something that a lot of people have not liked in the US, particularly because there was a tradition in the South of denying IDs to African Americans and then saying, oh, you can't vote.
I, for one, think AI will make it worse indirectly because economically it will probably lead to a more unequal wealth and income distribution. So when you have greater disparity, then it will be a more fertile ground for backsliding.
Okay, that's something we work really hard on in our research center, which, by the way, is called the Sloan Center. And I think Gary's right that is the default, but it doesn't have to be that way. So you could push AI in different directions. So there's an economic piece and there's an identity piece. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea. I mean, public opinion has come in the direction that you're suggesting, that universal ID needed for voting. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, including a lot of Democrats. The Democratic establishment is not so keen on it, and people who understand how things work in the South also are not so keen on it. If you had a bipartisan major public policy investment in getting everybody an ID, and you gave an enough time was allowed to pass for that to actually happen, then I would be all in favor of ID. The problem is it's usually proposed, we're going to do this in the next election, and you don't have a driver's license, too bad. You don't have access to a birth certificate, too bad. And so it appears to be a kind of partisan tool to reduce turnout among certain sectors. If you could get past that, I think it'd be a great thing.
Thank you. Well, hold on. Next to you. She was before you. Yes.
Sorry. So my name is Ceylan. I'm from Turkey, so I know a little bit about backsliding democracies. So my question is, some of the things you mentioned as indicators of backsliding can be argued as being pro-democracy. For example, if the president fires bureaucrats, you could argue that the people elected the president to enact his agenda, and if these bureaucrats are slow rolling his agenda, they should be fired. So how would you counter argue that?
And that's definitely an argument that's made. It's made with regard to the civil bureaucracy administration as well as courts. These unelected judges are making decisions that we don't like. In order for there to be effective democracy, you need both horizontal and vertical accountability. If you have only, all institutions, all positions of power in the public sector are elected, that is prone to a kind of totalitarianizing under single party rule of those institutions. So let me give you an example. Mexico, López Obrador, who was the last president, had a big old chip on his shoulder because he thought that his election victory was stolen from him in 2006 and again in 2012. And so he went after the election administration body known as the INE, which is an amazing organization that was really crucial in the transition to democracy in Mexico. I wish we had an INE type administration in the U.S. So he went after it and tried to politicize it. The courts got in the way of that and said, no, you can't do that. So then he went after the courts. And so, unelected judges, why should we have unelected judges? So now there's been a constitutional reform such that all federal judges in Mexico are elected right up to the Supreme Court. Now, that may sound okay, but when the system is basically controlled by one political party, that means that that the justice system is now basically an outcropping of the official party. So you really do need some kind of, horizontal accountability. You need to have whistleblowers. You need to have legislators who have, from the opposition, who have some ability to investigate and to voice the positions of their people, even if it's not a majority after that election. You need a mix of vertical and horizontal accountability for democracy to work. One of the problems, I probably don't tell you this, one of the problems is people often like what backsliding leaders do. Let's be honest about that. So think about El Salvador. Bukele, became very popular by reducing crime. Probably appearing to reduce crime more than he actually did, but still, it was a very insecure country, lots of personal, crime against people, violent crime, and that reduced, and people love that. He also undermined institutions of horizontal accountability. So eventually, when he's up for re-election, he's re-elected handily, no problem. but he's cutting away at accountability in such a manner that eventually people might decide we don't want to have you as our president anymore, and lo and behold, they wake up and find out they can't really do that. So it's the apocryphal story of the frog in the boiling water. By the way, very nicely modeled by Adam Jaworski and Zhou-Chan Luo in a formal paper where, you slowly are losing that capacity to hold them to account vertically because of the chipping away of horizontal accountability, and you wake up one morning and you can't get rid of them anymore.
All right, let's take one more question at the back. And then you can also get the free Kindle ebook if you beat your competitors to it. So be sharp.
It's not time-based. So.
Well, I'm trying to make it a bit more exciting, Julia. But then Sue has a few minutes to hang around, and I'll take questions one-on-one or small group afterwards. Okay. But last question. Yeah.
Yes.
My name's Ashrit. Thank you for coming. My question's about kind of reversing backsliding, in that you talked about the need for a opposition or somebody to represent the minority. And you talked also about how removing backsliders often comes from when they lose popular support. In the age of 24/7 media and biased media, do you feel like that's possible, or how would you go about basically breaking us out of this cycle of backsliders, given that some people simply may not have access to information that would cause them to kind of break out and lose support?
Yeah, thank you. Think back to what happened in 2024 in the U.S. So Donald Trump had a very controversial first term. New president comes in, new administration, all kinds of stuff happens. And then Donald Trump is reelected in 2024. Overwhelming support, lots of population types who shifted in his favor. Why did that happen? Well, it happened largely because you had a very unpopular incumbent president and you had economic outcomes that people didn't like. Sort of pocketbook stuff that they didn't like. In political science, we call that retrospective economic voting. It just means, like, what have you done for me lately in terms of, have my real wages gone up in the 6 months before the election? So that to some extent is information that is not manipulated directly by fake news and, internet, algorithms and so forth. People actually do still have access to some information that they think is reasonable for making decisions about how to vote. And you see that in a lot of places. It does, even when it's a situation of democratic backsliding, the party in power needs to pay attention to being able to win elections the old-fashioned way. And I think that was an error of the Biden administration. I think that they didn't pay enough attention to short-term economic outcomes. There was a very, very ambitious investments in long-term, good economic and climate and so forth policies, but there were short-term changes, improvements that people needed to see. So, and when things get bad enough, and this is echoing something I said earlier, people do actually start to worry about the loss of democratic rights and freedoms and abuses, the abuses that arise from autocratic rule, and also just the autocracies. There's a flexibility of that kind of decision making, but there's also a kind of stochastic, random up and down instability that people don't like, including markets and business sectors don't particularly. I don't have to tell you guys, they don't particularly like that either. There are, to leave on an optimistic note, we do see important actors standing up to autocratizing leaders in ways that are effective. The federal courts in the United States have been heroic. And I think we don't recognize that enough because there's always that asterisk that says, but the Supreme Court, and it's true, and that's a problem. But the federal bench has been heroic.